Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are continuing our series of reading the journals of Ralph Waldo Emerson. We are now on Journal 8, which is subtitled The Wide World Number 7, and it picks up with Emerson's life in the year 1822. And he was, I believe, 19 years old at this time, so still a very young man. Lots of interesting thoughts, and we are going to go ahead and get into them. This selection starts with a quote from Marcus Antoninus in Greek, and like I mentioned in the first video, unless the translation is given in the annotation, I will not be translating those into English because it is essentially time prohibitive to read thousands of pages of a journal and translate all of them and be able to upload them. It's just not practical doing this. So I will skip over them. However, I will be saying when I skip over them. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Journal 8, The Wide World Number 7. Boston, July 11th, 1822. I dedicate my book to the spirit of America. I dedicate it to that living soul which doth exist somewhere beyond the fancy, to whom the divinity hath assigned the care of this bright corner of the universe. I bring my little offering in this month, which covers the continent with matchless beauty, to the shrine which distant generations shall load with sacrifice, and distant ages shall admire afar off. With a spark of prophetic devotion, I hasten to hail the genius who yet counts the tardy years of childhood, but who is increasing unawares in the twilight and swelling into strength until the hour when he shall break the cloud to show his colossal youth and cover the firmament with the shadow of his wings. Emerson then continues his journal in the evening of the same day, saying, "It is the slow patriotism which forgets to love till all the world have set the example. If the nations of Europe can find anything to idolize in their ruinous and enslaved institutions, we are content, though we are astonished at their satisfaction. But let them not ignorantly mock at the pride of an American, as if it were misplaced or unfounded, when that free man is giving an imperfect expression to his sense of his condition. He rejoices in the birthright of a country where the freedom of his opinion and action is so perfect that every man enjoys exactly that consideration to which he is entitled, and each mind, as in the bosom of a family, institutes and settles a comparison of its powers with those of its fellow, and quietly takes that stand which nature intended for it. He points to his native land as the only one where freedom has not degenerated into licentiousness, in whose well-ordered districts education and intelligence dwell with good morals, whose rich estates peacefully descended from sire to son without the shadow of an interference from private violence or public tyranny, whose offices of trust and seats of science are filled by minds of republican strength and elegant accomplishments. Xenophon and Thucydides would have thought it a theme better worthy of their powers than Persia or Greece, and her revolution would furnish Plutarch with a list of heroes. If the Constitution of the United States outlives a century, it will be a matter of deep congratulation to the human race, for the utopian dreams which visionaries have pursued and sages exploded will find their beautiful theories rivaled and outdone by the reality which it has pleased God to bestow upon united America." Saturday evening, July 13th. I have proposed to attempt the consideration of those different aspects under which we are accustomed to view the divinity. I shall endeavor first to give some account of this relation to us, the founder of the moral law. It is not necessary to describe that law, otherwise than by saying that it is the sovereign necessity which commands every mind to abide by one mode of conduct and to reject another, by joining to the one a perfect satisfaction, while it pursues the other with indefinite apprehensions. Its divine origin is fully shown by its superiority to all other principles of our nature. It seems to be more essential to our constitution than any other feeling whatever. It dwells so deeply in the human nature that we feel it to be implied in consciousness. Other faculties fail. Memory sleeps, judgment is impaired or ruined, imagination droops, but the moral sense abides there still. In our every dreams, it wakes and judges amid the chaos of the rest. The depths of its foundations in the heart and the subtlety of its nature in eluding investigations into the causes and character distinguish it eminently above other principles. If you compare it, for example, with the phenomena of taste, which also appear to be universal, we shall readily discern a considerable distinction withdrawing from the one its transient resemblance. The judgment which determines a circle to be more beautiful than a square, or a rose to be fairer than a clod, is not founded upon aught existing in the mind independent of the senses, but is manifestly derived from the humble sources of the material world. It is nothing but a power to decide upon the pleasures of sense. If this be not the limit of the province of taste, if it ever rise to the judgment of questions which seem to involve moral beauty, it is only where it begins to blend with the moral sense and become ennobled by its connection. But that sovereign sense whereof we speak leaves the material world and its subordinate knowledge to subordinate faculties, and marshals before its divine tribunal the motives of action, the secrets of character, and the interests of the universe. It has no taint of mortality in the purity and unity of its intelligence. It is perfectly spiritual. It sometimes seems to sanction that Platonic dream that the soul of the individual was but an emanation from the abyss of deity and about to return whence it flowed. So it seems to predict on supreme authority that fate which is to be declared when time shall cease. It seems to be the only human thought which is admitted to partake of the counsels of the eternal world, and to give note already to man of the event and the sentence to which he is doomed. Emerson changes the subject to God. We have one remarkable evidence to the character from eternity of that being and the divine determination to make man in the image of God. In all the insignificance and imperfection of our nature, in the guilt to which we are liable, and the calamity which guilt has accumulated, man triumphs to remember that he bears about him a spark which all beings venerate and acknowledge to be the emblem of God, which may be violated, but which cannot be extinguished. And we remark with delight the confirmations of this belief in the opening features of human character. And the little joy of the child who plants a seed and sees himself instrumental in the creation of a flower forcibly reminds us of that beneficence which built the heavens and the earth and saw that it was good. Here follows a poem called The River. Among the bulrushes I lay, which deck the river's murmuring tide. Upon those banks no men abide, but swans come sailing in their pride, in graceful float into the quiet bay. Fast sailed the golden fishes by, and some leaped out to see the sky, nor saw the bird that stooped from high until he broke the wave's white crest, and bore the flapping fish aloft to his nest. An April cloud blew o'er the stream, and cast its big drops down. They oped the lily's covering brown, and shed its steaming perfume round, and golden insects flew unto that flower supreme. Emerson changes the subject to drama, and the date is simply put as July. The grand object of the drama is to claim the affections by awakening sympathy. It represents an accumulation of human woe with gorgeous pomp to move the pity and indignation of a susceptible audience. Its triumph is complete when the passions of the multitude, which naturally move in unison, at last aid each other to some general utterance, and consent to the weakness of feelings which in an individual would be ridiculous. From the theatre, then, drive out the buyers and sellers of corruption, who have made it a den of vice, and make it an oracle of those opinions and sentiments which multiply and strengthen the bonds of society. The more we reflect upon the subject, the more thoroughly we shall be convinced how practicable it is to produce a theatre of an actively useful character. It is a mistake to suppose that only vicious gratification can raise sufficient excitement to draw men together around a stage. On the contrary, what an indistinguishable thirst for eloquence, however rude, exists in every breast. It is natural that we pant to feel those thrilling sensations of a most agreeable character which passionate and powerful declamation never fails to move. They are akin to the emotions produced by the sublime, in sense or thought. And for these, the fictitious distresses of exalted personages amid the passage of wonderful events, such as a pure play will freely admit, seem to afford every desirable facility. Besides, we have direct testimony of the certainty of success in the instance of the Greek tragedy, which, without impurity, was universally popular at Athens. Sunday, September 7th. As for that hoary-headed error which considers reason as opposed to Scripture, and which frequently and loudly condemns reason as an adversary and a seducer, as unbelieving and profane, instead of placing idiots in his universe capable only of sensual gratification, able only to obey instincts, and requiring every moment a new direction from heaven to prevent them from groveling in the dirt, or being destroyed by the beasts, God has peopled it with images of himself, and kindled within them the light of his own understanding, a portion of that ray which illuminates, as it is formed, the creation. He has communicated to them an intelligence by which they are enabled to see their way in a universe where other beings are blind, to behold him and the relation to him, to read and understand all those communications which in past or future time he is pleased to make. It is an intelligence by which they find themselves distinguished from his other creations. There are about and amidst them 1,000 different properties. There are hills and waters, trees and flowers, the living forms of nature and stars of the firmament, but they are still and brutish. There is no eye and voice within them to detect and declare the stupendous glory which surrounds them. They lack the living spirit which opens the eyes of man, and without which the universe is as if it were not, and the glory of deity is darkness. It is an intelligence which soars above these charms of the material world, and can condemn them in the comparison with the objects which it is capable of enjoying. In fine, it is an intelligence which reveals to man another condition of existence, and a nearer approach to the Supreme Being. This intelligence is reason. Yet some there are who tell you, as if it involved no inconsistency, and certainly no sin, to avoid profaning the revelations of God by submitting them to the tribunal of man's reason, who seek to walk implicitly by a law which they do not and will not understand, because they refuse to apply to its explanation that light with which their Maker has furnished them. It is not only a wilful perversion and abuse of a priceless gift, but it is a most ungrateful neglect of divine mercy, and a neglect which incurs a tremendous responsibility. A journal entry for October. In proposing schemes of reformation in so important a matter as the drama, one should be cautious to avoid running into systems too visionary for popular understanding. The scholar in his closet must be aware lest his poetical imaginations of the beauty of tragedy lead him into fields beyond the track of common opinion, and to render his speculations of no use. Nevertheless, it appears to me that the bold and beautiful personification in Milton's Penseresso is not an unapt description of the true drama. Sometime let gorgeous tragedy with sceptred paw come sweeping by, presenting Thebes in Pelops' line, and the tale of Troy divine. For we wish that tragedy should take advantage of that weakness, or perhaps virtue, in our nature which bears such an idolatrous love for the emblems of royalty, and that its moral lessons should be couched in the grand and pathetic fables which antiquity affords. Owing to the identity of human character in all ages, there is as much instruction in the tale of Troy as in the annals of the French Revolution. There is an embellishment which I would recommend, though out of place here. I mean the introduction of prophecies. The author of Guy Mannering and The Bride of Lammermoor knew the value of the charm and has made fine use of the fascination. It is the most beautiful use of supernatural machinery in fiction. October, Thursday evening. When I was a lad, said the bearded islander, we had commonly a kind of vast musical apparatus in the Pacific Islands, which must appear as fabulous to you as it proved fatal to us. On the banks of the rivers there were abundance of siffar trees, which consist of vast trunks perforated by a multitude of natural tubes, without having any external verdure. When the roots of these were connected with waters of the river, the water was instantly sucked up by some of the tubes and discharged again by others, and when properly echoed, the operation was attended by the most beautiful musical sounds in the world. My countrymen built their churches to the great Zoa upon the margin of the water, and enclosed a suitable number of these trees, hoping to entertain the ears of the god with this sweet harmony. Finding, however, by experience that the more water the pipes drew, the more rich and various were the sounds of the organ, they constructed a very large temple with high walls of clay and stone to make the echoes very complete, and enclosed 100 siffars. When the edifice was complete, 6,000 people assembled to hear the long expected song. After they had waited a long time and the waters of the river were beginning to rise, the instrument suddenly began to emit the finest notes imaginable. Through some of the broader pipes, the water rushed with the voice of thunder, and through others with the sweetness of one of your lutes. In a short time, the effect of the music was such that it seemed to have made all the hearers mad. They laughed and wept alternately, and began to dance, and such was their delight that they did not perceive the disaster which had befallen their organ. Owing to the unusual swell of the river and to some unaccountable irregularity in the ducts, the pipes began to discharge their contents within the chapel. In a short time the evil became too apparent, for the water rose in spouts from the top of the larger ducts and fell upon the multitude within. Meantime the music swelled louder and louder, and every note was more ravishing than the last. The inconvenience of the falling water which drenched them was entirely forgotten, until finally the whole host of pipes discharged, every one, a volume of water upon the charmed congregation. The faster poured the water, the sweeter grew the music, and the flooring being covered with the torrent, the people began to float upon it with intolerable ecstasies. Finally, the whole multitude swam about in this deluge, holding up their heads with open mouths and ears, as if to swallow the melody, whereby they swallowed much water. Many hundreds were immediately drowned, and their enormous pipes, as they emptied the river, swelled their harmony to such perfection that the ear could no longer bear it, and they who escaped the drowning died of the exquisite music. Thenceforward there was no more use of the siffar trees in the Pacific Islands. Emerson changes the subject here to the land of Naught. It is now 19 years since I left the land of Naught, and I may safely say that in the countries in which I have passed my time since that period, it has been invariably true that there is more crime, misery, and vexation in every one of them in the course of a single year than transpires in the peaceful land of Naught in the lapse of many centuries. Except for the existence of one single institution which has been established from time immemorial, there is no question that a vast tide of emigration would rapidly flow into that country. This institution is a rigorous Alien Act which ordains that no man who leaves the limits of the country shall ever be permitted to set foot within it again. But, to my knowledge, many who have left it have often afterwards looked back to its pleasant abodes and desired in vain to return. Saturday evening, November. My adventurous and superficial pen has not hesitated to advance thus far upon these old but sublime foundations of our faith, and thus, without adding a straw to the weight of evidence or making the smallest discovery, it has still served to elevate somewhat my own notions by bringing me within prospect of the labors of the sages. After the primitive apostles, I apprehend that Christianity is indebted to those who have established the grounds upon which it rests, to Clarke, Butler, and Paley, to Sherlock, and to the incomparable Newton. And when it shall please my wayward imagination to suffer me to go drink of these crystal fountains, or when my better judgment shall have at last triumphed over the demon imagination, and shall itself conduct me thither, I shall be proud and glad of the privilege. For the present, I must be content and make myself wiser as I may by the same loose speculations upon divine themes. I have come to the close of the sheets which I dedicated to the genius of America, and notice that I have devoted nothing in my book to any peculiar topics which concern my country. But is not every effort that her sons make to advance the intellectual interest of the world, and every new thought which is struck out from the minds of religion and morality, a forward step in the path of her greatness? Peace be with her progressive greatness, and prosperity crown her giant minds. A victory is achieved today for one whose name perchance is written highest in the volume of futurity. And there is a footnote which says, Webster was chosen representative to Congress by a majority of 1,078 votes this morning, RWE. Boston, November 4th, 1822. Journal 9. The Wide World, Number 8. Dedication. Boston, November 6th, 1822. To glory which is departed, to majesty which hath ceased, to intellect which is quenched, I bring no homage, no, not a grain of gold. For why seek to contradict the voice of nature and of God, which saith over them, It is finished, by wasting our imaginations upon the deaf ear of the dead? Turn rather to the mighty multitude, the thunder of whose footsteps shakes now the earth, whose faces are flushed by the blood of life, whose eye is enlightened by a living soul. Is there none in the countless assembly who hath a claim on the reverence of the sons of Minerva? I have chosen one from the throng. Upon his brow have the muses hung no garland. His name hath never been named in the halls of fashion or the palaces of state. But I saw prophecy drop the knee before him, and I hastened to pay the tribute of a page. Emerson enters a new subject here called Vision of Slavery. In my dreams I departed to distant climes and to different periods, and my fancy presented before me many extraordinary societies and many old and curious institutions. I sat on the margin of the river of golden sands when the thirsty leopard came thither to drink. It was just dawn, and the shades were chased rapidly from the eastern firmament by the golden magnificence of day. As I contemplated the brilliant spectacle of an African morning, I thought on those sages of this storied land who instructed the infancy of the world. Meanwhile the sun arose and cast a full light over a vast and remarkable landscape. About the river the country was green, and its bed reflected the sunbeams from pebbles and gold. Far around was an ample plain with a soil of yellow sand, glittering everywhere with dew, and interspersed with portions of forest, which extended into the plain from the mountains which surrounded this wide amphitheater. The distant roar of lions ceased to be heard, and I saw the leopard bathing his spotted limbs and swimming towards the woods which skirted the water. But his course was stopped. An arrow from the wood pierced his head, and he floated lifeless ashore. I looked then to see whence the slayer should have come, and beheld not far off a little village of huts built of canes. Presently I saw a band of families come out from their habitations, and these naked men, women, and children sung a hymn to the sun, and came merrily down to the river with nets in their hands to fish. And a crimson bird with a yellow crest flew over their heads as they went, and lighted on a rock in the midst of the river, and sung pleasantly to the savages while he brushed his feathers in the stream. The boys plunged into the river, and swam towards the rock. But upon a sudden I saw many men dressed in foreign garb run out from the wood where the leopard had been killed. And these surrounded the fishers and bound them with cords and hastily carried them to their boats, which lay concealed behind the trees. So they sailed down the stream, talking aloud and laughing as they went. But they that were bound gnashed their teeth and uttered so piteous a howl that I thought it were a mercy if the river had swallowed them. In my dream I launched my skiff to follow the boats and redeem the captives. They went in ships to other lands, and I could never reach them, albeit I came near enough to hear the piercing cry of the chained victims, which was louder than the noise of the ocean. In the nations to which they were brought, they were sold for a price, and compelled to labor all the day long, and scourged with whips, until they fell dead in the fields and found rest in the grave. Canst thou ponder the vision, and show why Providence suffers the land of its richest productions to be thus defiled? Do human bodies lodge immortal souls, and is this tortured life of bondage and tears a fit education for the bright ages of heaven and the commerce of angels? Is man the image of his Maker? And shall this fettered and broken frame, this marred and brutalized soul, become perfect as he is perfect? This slave hath eat the bread of captivity, and drank the waters of bitterness, and cursed the light of the sun as it dawned on his bed of straw, and worked hard and suffered long, while never an idea of God hath kindled in his mind from the hour of his birth to the hour of his death. And yet thou sayest that a merciful Lord made man in his benevolence to live and enjoy, to take pleasure in his works and worship him forever. Confess that there are secrets in that providence which no human eye can penetrate, which darken the prospect of faith and teach us the weakness of our philosophy. November 8. At least we may look farther than the simple fact, and perhaps aid our faith by freer speculation. I believe that nobody now regards the maxim that all men are born equal as anything more than a convenient hypothesis or an extravagant declamation. For the reverse is true, that all men are born unequal in personal powers and in those essential circumstances of time, parentage, country, fortune. The least knowledge of the natural history of man adds another important particular to these, namely, what class of men he belongs to, European, Moor, Tartar, African, because nature has plainly assigned different degrees of intellect to these different races, and the barriers between are insurmountable. This inequality is an indication of the design of Providence that some should lead and some should serve. For when an effect invariably takes place from causes which Heaven established, we surely say with safety that Providence designed that result. Throughout society, there is therefore not only the direct and acknowledged relation of king and subject, master and servant, but a secret dependence quite as universal of one man upon another, which sways habits, opinions, conduct. This prevails to an infinite extent, and however humbling the analogy, it is nevertheless true that the same pleasure and confidence which the dog and horse feel when they rely upon the superior intelligence of man is felt by the lower parts of our own species with reference to the higher. Now, with these concessions, the question comes to this: whether this known and admitted assumption of power by one part of mankind over the other can ever be pushed to the extent of total possession, and that without the will of the slave. It can hardly be said that the whole difference of the will divides the natural servitude of which we have spoken from the forced servitude of slavery. For it is not voluntary on my part that I am born a subject. Contrariwise, if my opinion had been consulted, it is 10 to 1 I should have been the great mogul. The circumstances in which every man finds himself he owes to fortune and not to himself. And those men who happen to be born in the lowest caste in India suffer much more perhaps than the kidnapped African, with no other difference in their lot than this, that God made the one wretched and man the other. Except that there is a dignity in suffering from the ordinances of supreme power, which is not at all common to the other class. One lot is as little enviable as the other. When all this is admitted, the question may still remain entirely independent and untouched, apart from the consideration of slavery as agreeable or contradictory to the analogies of nature, whether any individual has a right to deprive any other individual of freedom without his consent, or whether he may continue to withhold the freedom which another hath taken away. Upon the first question, whether one man may forcibly take away the freedom of another, the weakness and incapacity of Africans would seem to have no bearing, though it may affect the second. Still, it may be advanced that the beasts of the field are all evidently subjected to the dominion of man, and, with the single restriction of the laws of humanity, are left entirely at his will. And why are they, and how do we acquire this declaration of heaven? Manifestly from a view of the perfect adaptation of these animals to the necessities of man, and of the advantage which many of them find in leaving the forest for the barnyard. If they had reason, their strength would be so far superior to ours that besides our inability to use them, it would be inconsistent with nature. So that these three circumstances are the foundation of our dominion, viz., their want of reason, their adaptation to our wants, and their own advantage when domesticated. But these three circumstances may very well apply to the condition of the blacks, and it may be hard to tell exactly where the difference lies. Is it in reason? If we speak in general of these two classes, man and beast, we say that they are separated by the distinction of reason, and the want of it, and the line of this distinction is very broad. But if we abandon this generalization and compare the classes of one with the classes of the other, we shall find our boundary line growing narrower and narrower, and individuals of one species approaching individuals of the other, until the limits become finally lost in the mingling of the classes. November 14th. If we pursue a revolting subject to its greatest lengths, we should find that in all those three circumstances, which are the foundations of our dominion over the beasts, very much may be said to apply them to the African species, even in the last vis-a-vis the advantage which they derive from our care. For the slaveholders violently assert that their slaves are happier than the freedmen of their class, and the slaves refuse oftentimes the offer of their freedom. Nor is this owing merely to the barbarity which has placed them out of the power of attaining a competence by themselves. For it is true that many a slave under the warm roof of a humane master, with easy labors and regular subsistence, enjoys more happiness than his naked brethren, parched with thirst on a burning sand, or endangered in the crying wilderness of their native land. This is all that is offered in behalf of slavery. We shall next attempt to knock down the Hydra. To establish, by whatever specious argument, the perfect expediency of the worst institution on earth is prima facie an assault upon reason and common sense. No ingenious sophistry can ever reconcile the unperverted mind to the pardon of slavery. Nothing but tremendous familiarity and the bias of private interest. Under the influence of better arguments than can be offered in support of slavery, we should sustain our tranquillity by the confidence that no surrender of our opinion is ever demanded, and that we are only required to discover the lurking fallacy which the disputant acknowledges to exist. It is an old dispute which is not now and never will be totally at rest, whether the human mind be or be not a free agent, and the asserter of either side must be scandalized by the bare naming of the theory of the man that may impose servitude on his brother. For if he is himself free, and it offends the attributes of God to have him otherwise, it is manifestly a bold stroke of impiety to wrest the same liberty from his fellow. And if he is not free, then his inhuman barbarity ascends to derive its origin from the author of all necessity. A creature who is bound by his hopes of salvation to imitate the benevolence of better beings, and to do all the kindness in his power, fastens manacles on his fellow with an ill grace. A creature who holds a little lease of life upon the arbitrary tenure of God's good pleasure improves his moment strangely by abusing God's best works, his own peers. Saturday evening, November 16th. The child who refuses to pollute its little lips with a lie, and the archangel who refuses with indignation to rebel in the armies of heaven against the Most High, act alike in obedience to a law which pervades all intelligent beings. This law was the moral sense, a rule coextensive and coeval with mind. It derives its existence from the eternal character of the deity, of which we spoke above, and seems of itself to imply and therefore to prove his existence. Whence comes this strong universal feeling that approves or abhors actions? Manifestly not from matter, which is altogether unmoved by it, and the connection of which with it is a thing absurd, but from a mind of which it is the essence. That mind is God. This sentiment which we bear within us is so subtle and unearthly in its nature, so entirely distinct from all sense and matter, and hence so difficult to be examined, and withal so decisive and invariable in its dictates, that it clearly partakes of another world than this, and looks forward to it in the end. It is further to be observed of it that its dictates are never blind, are never capricious, but however they may seem to differ, are always discovered on a close and profound examination to point to a faultless and unattainable perfection. They seem to refer to a sublime course of life and action which nowhere exists, or to which we are not privy, and to be an index of the Creator's character lent to mankind in vindication or illustration of the command, "Be ye perfect, as he is perfect." This sentiment differs from the affections of the heart and from the faculties of the mind. The affections are undiscriminating and capricious. The moral sense is not. The powers of the intellect are sometimes wakeful and sometimes dull, alive with interest to one subject and dead to the charm of another. There are no ebbs and flows, no change, no contradictions in this. Its lively approbation never loses its pleasure. Its aversion never loses its sting. Its oracular answers might be sounded through the world, for they are always the same. Motives and characters are amenable to it, and the golden rules which are the foundation of its judgment we feel and acknowledge, but do not understand. Emerson changes his subject to justice. Quote, "Even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips." End quote. The bolder misdoer who transgresses the law of justice grapples with he knows not what. He has offended against an essential attribute of the divinity, which will plead against him inexorably until it be avenged. His rash hand has disordered a part of the moral machinery of the universe, and he is in peril of being crushed by the mischief he has caused. How shall man reconcile his freedom with that eternal necessary chain of cause and consequence which binds him and nature down to an irreversible decree? How shall he reconcile his freedom with that prophetic omniscience which beheld his end long before the infant entered on the world? Perhaps he is a slave, and men have worn his limbs with irons and his soul with suffering. The name of virtue and the smile of kindness never have stooped to alleviate his hard and bitter bondage. But ere his little day of apathy and distress was done, he cursed God and died. Hath he descended into hell? Or how dost thou reconcile the creation and destiny of this being with that infinite and benevolent justice that would not abuse its omnipotence and would not create a mind to be miserable? Tell not that man of those feelings and thoughts which give a joy to your existence and warm your heart to the world, for it will be but to mock his wretchedness. Tell him not of the dignity of human nature, of its benevolence and philanthropy. He will clink his chains at the word. He scoffs bitterly at your pictures of the golden gates of heaven, for they are closed on him. The man is bold who undertakes to answer beyond a doubt these perplexing questions. But theology would be vain science, unworthy of our attention, if it left them all in their full force without notice or solution. If an ignorant man were carried from his closet to the prisons and penitentiaries of a vast kingdom, and shown a multitude of men confined and scourged and forced to labor, and informed that this was the act of the government, if he knew nothing more of that state, and perhaps foolishly conceived that its limits extended no further than the walls wherein he stood, it would be a very plain conclusion that this government was a savage and outrageous tyranny, while perhaps at that very moment the government was the most perfect and beneficent in the world. Our rash conclusions from the dark side of human affairs are analogous to these, and like these are to be corrected by broader views of the system which we misunderstand. The questions we have named are incidental to the subject, but of such importance that we shall digress from the main topic to attempt to answer them. The endeavor is always laudable to clear up the darkness which settles around portions of the system. God in heaven is answerable for his works to those principles which he has set within us to judge of them. To the discussion of some of them our nature is incompetent. One of the best satires upon women is the popular opinion of the 3rd century that they who took wives were all others the most subject to the influence of evil demons. Men's minds visit heaven as they visit earth, and hence the Turkish heaven is a harem, the Scandinavian a hunting field, the Arabian a place of wheaten cakes and murmuring fountains. We've supple understanding, and so it comes that a new religion ever suits itself to the state in which 'tis born, whether despotism or democracy, as Montesquieu has remarked, quote, 4 daughters make the family of time, but rosy summer is the darling child, end quote. Saturday evening, November 23rd. The hours of social intercourse, of gratified hope, of the festival board, have just now yielded to quieter pleasures of the closet and the pen. This tender flesh is warmly clad, the blood leaps in the vessels of life, health and hope write their results on the passing moment, and these things make the pleasure of a mortal, bodily, mental being. There are in the world at this moment 100,000,000 men whose history today may match with mine, not counting the numberless ones whose day was happier. There are also in existence here a countless crowd of inferior animals who have had their lesser cup filled full with pleasure. The sunny lakes reflect the noonday beams from the glittering tribes which cover its bottom, rapid as thought in their buoyant motions, leaping with the elasticity and gladness of life. The boundless ocean supports in its noisy waves its own great population. The beautiful dolphin, the enormous whale, and the huge sea monsters of 1,000 families and 1,000 uncouth gambols dash through its mighty domain in the fullness of sensual enjoyment. The air is fanned by innumerable wings, the green woods are vocal with the song of the insect and the bird. The beasts of the field fill the lands untenanted by man, and beneath the sod the mole and the worm take their pleasure. All this vast mass of animated matter is moving and basking under the broad orb of the sun, is drinking in the sweetness of the air, is feeding on the fruits of nature, is pleased with life, and loath to lose it. All this pleasure flows from a source. That source is the benevolence of God. This is the first superficial glance at the economy of the world, and necessarily leaves out 1,000 circumstances. Let us take a closer view, and begin with the human mind. I find within me a motley array of feelings that have no connection with my clayey frame, and I call them my mind. Every day of my life this mind draws 1,000 curious conclusions from the different things which it beholds. With a wanton variety which tires of sameness, it throws all its thoughts into innumerable lights, and changes the fantastic scene by varying its own operations upon it. By combining and separating, by comparing and judging, by remembering and inventing all things, every one of these little changes within produces a pleasure, the pleasure of power or of sight. But besides the mere fact that the mind acts, there is a most rich variety in thought, and I grossly undervalue the gift I possess, if I limit its capacity to the puny round of everyday sensations. It is a ticket of admission to another world of ineffable grandeur, to unknown orders of things which are as real as they are stupendous. As soon as it has advanced a little in life, it opens its eye to thoughts which tax its whole power, and delight it by their greatness and novelty. These suggest kindred conceptions which give birth to others, and thus draw the mind on in a path which it perceives is interminable and is of interminable joy. To this high-favored intellect is added an intuition that it can never end, and that with its choice it can go forward to make the boon of immortal happiness. These are causes and states of pleasure which no reason can deny. But this is the true history of all the individuals of the mighty nations that breathe today. These point also to a source, which is the benevolence of God. But a groan of the dying, a cry of torture from the diseased, the sob of the mourner, answer to this thanksgiving of human nature and produce a discord in our anthem of praise. If God is good, why are any of his creatures unhappy? Those who consider the foundations of human happiness find that it is a contrasted and comparative thing. High and multiplied sources of pleasure are often in our possession without being enjoyed, for they never were lacking. God disturbs or removes them for a time, and he is dull who sees no wisdom in this mode of giving them value and sharpening the blunted edge of appetite. Thus, health and peace are insipid goods until you have been able to compare them with the torments of pain and the visitations of war. And after this comparison has once been made, man runs riot in holding them. Next, it should be remembered that we wisely assume the righteousness of the Creator in placing man in a probationary state. We do not seek with vain ambition to question the abstruse and unsearchable ground of this ordination, because it is plain matter of fact that we are incompetent to the discussion. This being assumed, there is no longer any doubt of the divine benevolence arising from the existence of evil. Evil is the rough and stony foundation of human virtue, weaning man away from the seductive dangers of vicious, transient, destructive pleasures to a hold and security of paradise, where they are perpetual and perfect. Of Professor N, Shakespeare long ago wrote The Good and Bad Character. Oh, it is excellent to have a giant's strength, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant. The next journal entry is a poem, and it is subtitled Solitary Fancies. Rich in the playful joys of solitude, the peaceful muse begins her jubilee, when night's black car, sprinkled with golden stars, has chased the sun's magnificence away. Pleased with the closet's motley furniture, and broken shadows where the elves and gnomes fight with the rats for noise or victory, the muse roves boldly on her vagrant wing, disdains the recent times and days of dwarfs, and this cold land Apollo never knew, abandons with proud plumes the passing hour, and follows fancy through 1,000 worlds. It is a curious spectacle to see the panorama of unnumbered hues that her wild journey marshals round her eye, but icy reason scowls upon the show, and its gay battlements and beaming towers and shining forms all vanish at his frown. Yet I, who never bowed obedient neck to reason's iron yoke, will still rebel and vex the tyrant in his ancient halls. I'll ponder pleasantly the changing scenes and tell their wonders loudly on the lyre. November 29th, 1822. The ardor of my college friendship for blank is nearly extinct, and it is with difficulty that I can now recall those sensations of vivid pleasure which his presence was wont to waken spontaneously for a period of more than 2 years. To be so agreeably excited by the features of an individual personally unknown to me, and for so long a time, was surely a curious incident in the history of so cold a being and well worth a second thought. At the very beginning of our singular acquaintance, I noticed the circumstance in my wide world with an expression of curiosity with regard to the effect which time would have upon those feelings. To this day, our glance at meeting is not that of indifferent persons, and were he not so thoroughly buried in his martial cares, I might still entertain the hope of departed hours. Probably the abatement of my solitary enthusiasm is owing to the discouraging reports which I have gathered of his pursuits and character, so entirely inconsistent with the indications of his face. But it were much better that our connection should stop and pass off, as it now will, than to have had it formed and then broken by the late discovery of insurmountable barriers to friendship. From the first, I preferred to preserve the terms which kept alive so much sentiment rather than a more familiar intercourse, which I feared would end in indifference. Saturday evening, November 30th. Heraclitus was a fool who wept always for the miseries of human life. Or was he blind and deaf to beauty and melody? In his day, was the sky black, and were snakes instead of flowers coiled in his path? Was his mind reversed in its organization? Had he despair for hope and remorse for memory? Could his disordered eye discern a savage power sitting in this splendid universe, thwarting the good chances of fortune and promoting the bad, sowing seeds of sorrow for glory, turning grace and tranquility to desolation and heaven to hell? Then let him weep on. True philosophy hath a clear sight, and remarks amid the vast disproportions of human condition a great equalization of happiness, an intimate intermingling of pleasure with every gradation, down to the very lowest of all. Pleasant and joyous are the connections of our sympathy and affection. 'Tis proved by the very tear which marks their dissolution, and even that pang of separation and loss is relieved by its own indulgence. Happiness lies at our own door. Misery is further away, until I know by bitter personal experience that the world is the accursed seat of all misfortunes, and as long as I find it a garden of delights, I am bound to adore the beneficent author of my life. No representations of foreign misery can liquidate your debt to heaven. You must join the choral hymn to which the universe resounds in the ear of faith, and I think of philosophy. The mind can perceive a harmonious whole, combined and overruled by a sublime necessity, which embraces in its mighty circle the freedom of the individuals, and without subtracting from any, directs all their appropriate ends. It perceives a purpose to pain, and sees how the instruction and perfection of myriads is brought about by the spectacle of guilt and its punishment. That great and primeval necessity may make impossible an universe without evil, and perhaps found happiness everywhere, as here, upon the contrast of suffering. This question lies at the sources of things, and we are only indulged with an intimation that may make out the just goodness of the Deity. This connection may be deeper and more intimate than we are apt to imagine, and the circumstances observed just now seem to indicate that it is. That connection which subsists here in character will subsist in condition hereafter, and some plan will be developed in which the good of evil will be made plain on the general scale that cannot be explained upon the particular. Emerson here writes of greatness. Every man who enumerates the catalogue of his acquaintance is privately conscious, however reluctant to confess the inferiority, of a certain number of minds which do outrun and command his own, in whose company, despite the laws of good breeding and the fences of affection, his own spirit bows like the brothers' sheaves to Joseph's sheaf. He remembers the soothsayer's faithful account of Antony's guardian genius, which among other men was high and unmatchable, but quailed before Caesar's. He remembers also some of his companions, over whom his own spirit exercises the same mastery. And let no man complain of the inequality of such an ordination, or call fortune partial in the distribution of her blessings. December 21st. There is everything in America's favor to one who puts faith in those proverbial prophecies of the westward progress of the car of empire. Though there may be no more barbarians left to overrun Europe and extinguish forever the memory of its greatness, yet its rotten states, like Spain, may come to their decline by the festering and inveteracy of the faults of government. Aloof from the contagion during the long progress of their decline, America hath ample interval to lay deep and solid foundations for the greatness of the New World. And along the shores of the South Continent, to which the dregs of corruption of European society had been unfortunately transplanted, the fierceness of the present conflict for independence will, no doubt, act as a powerful remedy to the disease, by stirring up the slumbering spirits of those indolent zones to a consciousness of their power and destiny. Here, then, new Romes are growing, and the genius of man is brooding over the wide boundaries of infant empires, where yet are to be drunk the intoxicating draughts of honor and renown. Here are to be played over and again the bloody games of human ambition, bigotry, and revenge, and the stupendous drama of the passions to be repeated. Other Cleopatras shall seduce, Alexanders fight, and Caesars die. The pillars of social strength which we occupy ourselves in founding thus firmly to endure to future ages as the monuments of the wisdom of this, are to be shaken on their foundations with convulsions, proportioned to their adamantine strength. The time is come, the hour is struck. Already the actors in this immense and tremendous scene have begun to assemble. The doors of life in our mountain land are opened, and the vast swarm of population is crowding in, bearing in their hands the burden of sorrow and sin, of glory and science, which are to be mingled in their future fates. In the events and interests of these empires, the old tales of history and the fortunes of departed nations shall be thoroughly forgotten, and the name of Rome or Britain fall seldom on the ear. In that event, when the glory of Plato, Greece, of Cicero, of Rome, and of Shakespeare, of England, shall have died, who are they that are to write their names where all time shall read them, and their words be the oracle of millions? Let those who would pluck the lot of immortality from fate's urn look well to the future prospects of America. Friday evening, December 21st, 1822. Authors or books quoted or referred to in journals of 1822. Homer, Simonides, Heraclitus, Sophocles, Electra, Thucydides, Demosthenes, Bible, Zoroaster, Cicero, Lucretius, Horace, Plutarch, Tacitus, Germania, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, medieval mystery plays, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Bacon, Milton, Paradise Lost, Boileau, Locke on the Human Understanding, William Sherlock, Sermons on Faith, Newton, Burnet Memorial, Fontenelle, Pope, Richardson novels, Montesquieu, Butler, Analogy, Voltaire, David Hartley, Observations on Man, Dr. Johnson, Vanity of Human Wishes, Samuel Clarke, Priestley, Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Paley, Logan, Yarrow, Speeches of Pitt, Burke, Fox, Dugald Stewart, Philosophy of the Mind, Claudius Buchanan, Christian Researches in India, Abernathy, Buckminster Sermons, Arabian Nights, Scott, The Pirate, Minstrelsy, Byron, Corsair, Childe Harold, Fearing Travels in the United States, Sismondi, Italian Republics, Leigh Hunt, Song. This is the end of Journal number 9 by Ralph Waldo Emerson. In the next video, we will continue with Journal 10, subtitled The Wide World number 9. Thank you for listening.